Kids, today we're going to talk about Generation X, or Gen X. I am a Gen Xer. We're not talking about the band, we're talking about the group of people. We came after the baby boomers and before Gen Y. Gen X is an interesting crowd because we are possibly the first in American history that will end up not making progress, or actually decreasing progress, going backwards in the forward momentum of America. And it's an interesting scientific and socio circumstance that has brought us to this crossroads. And for many in Gen X, it's rather disheartening. At least for me, it has. I've sat and watched it and spoke about it, and it's like this slow train wreck that just unfolds. And I had some thoughts about it, so I wanted to share it with you. What makes our generation so unique? Our grandparents were products of the Great Depression, and they saved because they saw what their parents went through, and they were beaten into saving. Now, some of that generation also, which made it through better than others, continued to save very conservatively, and others, they spent on things that are status symbols, and they became kind of materialistic. And think of the comedy I Love Lucy, and how Lucy always tried to impress with a new dress, or show the ladies at the club or whatever. That was definitely my grandparents' generation. I had one set of grandparents that had money, and they were very conservative, and you wouldn't know they had a dime. I had another set of grandparents that had money, and they showed they had money, but they still saved. Very much an I Love Lucy type character, my one grandmother was. She was like the lady with the big hair, the long cigarette, and the Cadillac. She was great in her role, and she was fabulous. But she also was serious, and she saved too. So they took care of themselves. Now, the generation that they had, which is the baby boomers, the boomer generation, went butt wild because they did not know of the Great Depression. They heard about it, but it was somewhere in the distant past. Times were good, and they were going to get their party on. And since most of their parents were upwardly mobile and had money, time to get their party on. And party on they did. And they kind of split off into two groups, the conservative group and the more wild liberal group. Now, the conservative group drank like skunks. They just drank and plied each other with alcohol, smoked cigarettes, and they tried all the things that their more liberal friends, the hippies, did. They tried drugs behind the scenes. They tried swinging. They tried, all this stuff. They just were more quiet about it. To think that they were at all conservative in their true hearts, not compared to today. They were very, very liberal people. I grew up in a, quote, conservative household that was very liberal. And my parents drank like fish. They smoked like chimneys. And all kinds of assorted mess went on behind the scenes. It was also a generation that still was very violent, not only with each other, but with the children. So it wasn't surprising to see your mother get the shit beat out of her, or you get the shit beat out of yourself, or anything else. That was very common back in those days. And I was born in the mid-60s, and for my generation, we grew up watching this dichotomy, this conservatism on the one hand, but a lot of drinking and stuff went on. And then these hippies taking mushrooms and acid, and they were the entertainers, and they wrote the children's shows. So it was all rainbows and lollipops and unicorns, and one big happy family. We're all going to get along. And then there was this stark strangeness, because the television had come into play back in the 40s and I guess in the 50s it really came into its age. And by the time the mid-60s, 70s, it became a common element. So you had the first reruns, and those were the '50s shows, the Perfection, the Leave It to Beaver, and um, Donna Reed, and all that kind of stuff. That generation, that group, that never really happened, that they showed on television. It was surreal. Then you had things like Bewitched, which was very progressive because they slept in the same bed, and like for the first time on television, a married couple actually sleeping in the same bed. Could you believe that? And they tried to incorporate things like black people into the show and stuff like that. And there was this whole thing in the '70s of trying to normalize black people. And that was very much part of our growing up experience because we didn't, as a child, you didn't know any better. And TV was showing us that they were just okay and they could be with us and we could eat at the same table and go to parties and do business and all that kind of stuff. And there was a very big push from the creative side of Hollywood to make sure that black people were incorporated into American culture, which they had never been before. But we didn't know any better. Now, our parents, a lot of them, some of them very much identified with like the Archie Bunker character. And some of them more identified with Maude, and some of them could identify with both. But that was kind of the split in that group. Now, as the '80s rolled up, it was a whole different monster because the sexual revolution of the '60s and '70s led into the gender bending, anything goes '80s. And the '80s were but wild. It was a very wide opening of freedom for a lot of people to express themselves any way they wanted. Absolutely everyone was wearing makeup. Everybody was in different kinds of get-ups. Hair products everywhere. The '80s were a time to really, really get your you on. Now, for every yin, there's a yang. The religious group, the religious right, started pushing back hard on all this opening. That terrified them. So you started seeing these firebrand, what used to be out in tents and drive-in movies, these firebrand preachers starting to open these mega churches and then put them on television and speak to the whole country about this firebrand Christianity that was more severe than it had ever been before. And it caught on. And they made billions of dollars. And they built huge temples like the Crystal Cathedral and stuff, and with this firebrand sermons. And they decided to get political. About the end of the '80s, they'd had enough, and they decided they were going to muscle their way into the Republican Party, and they were going to swing it hard to the right, and they were going to keep swinging. And they did, and they have been, and they're still doing it. And there was a split. The country kind of split down the middle because most people, at least in my age group, unless you were, born in certain parts of the country, it was just okay to be open and real. And then I guess there was this whole other group that was just hidden and then shoved into these churches and kind of brainwashed that there's only one way to be and all this kind of stuff, which unbeknownst to a lot of us had occurred. So there was this great divide starting with Gen X. It was either extreme right or what looked like extreme left, but really wasn't because we had our grandparents' model of saving and more conservative values than our parents generally because we saw that their excesses were unsustainable in politics and personal lives and every other way. So a lot of Gen Xers are much more conservative than the boomers, but some of them went to the extreme. Now we see this again in Gen Y, but even much more to a more extreme extent. Gen Y is very, very relaxed, at least half of them, or maybe a little bit more than half. But there's another part of Gen Y which is really dark and very conservative and extremely intolerant and white. All white. It's just terrible. So then, now our parents' generation, they liked to party on, and they wanted nothing to interrupt their good time. So they made sure they cajoled and pushed their parents' generation in the legislature to take care of themselves, because they didn't want to flip the bill like was always the tradition, to take care of the elderly or throw them in homes or in the garbage can. So they pushed, the boomers pushed my grandparents' generation into voting for themselves in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and that took care of the problem. So they could just keep it on. And when Social Security started making a profit, they decided they were going to spend that and more besides, and just leave IOUs instead of saving up the money, because that was not my parents' generation. They just spent. They spent like crazy. And in many cases, they left nothing, or they made bad investments that burst in bubbles. So, you know, a lot of them are retiring now, not where they thought they would be, and looking at their children, Gen X, and grandchildren and Gen Y, and saying, wow, what a mess we've left them. And it must be hard for them. Seriously, I would be disheartened, almost ashamed if I was of that older age. Now, looking back and looking at the disaster they've left us in this second Great Depression that we're in, that we've been suffering through for years now. And it was a directly result of their policies and their greed, both in investments and in the management of this government, of our country. So we're here trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces in Gen X and go on from here and do something. But the problem is we can't talk to each other, because we've divided into three camps. We've divided into the extreme right, the extreme left, and the extremely indifferent. And if you try to be anything but indifferent, you're either viewed as extreme right or extreme left. So the indifferent folks insist on pure indifference. The extreme right looks at everybody that's not extreme right as if they're enemies, and the extreme left does the same thing. So there's three groups in my generation, and we can't talk to each other. Therefore, we can get nothing done. And we're failing miserably. Even people that we've known before, that we've met face to face, that we've had relationships with, even sexual relationships with, we can't even talk anymore, depending on where you sit. It's gotten that bad. Seriously. It's amazing to me. So, where to go from here? Who knows? It's like watching a three-way civil war. People that just don't want to deal with it, they put their head in the sand and they don't want to talk about it. Then you have the extreme right and the extreme left. And even people that are moderate, that want to talk about it, if they don't lean a particular way, even if they just kind of lean to the left won't accept them because they think they're being false. The people that don't want to talk at all about it, don't want to talk at all about it no matter what. And the extreme right will look at you like you're a complete enemy. Same if you lean a little bit to the right. Same thing. It's three extremes. So no one's ever going to have a voting majority. Ever. Never going to happen. And if it does, it only lasts one cycle and they'll change it. Seriously. It's really weird. These are very strange times. Generation X is profoundly dysfunctional, in my opinion. Have you seen any different than I do? Please let me know. I would love to hear your comments. Thanks. Have a good night.